There have been different types of sanctions placed on Zimbabwe over the years. Let's start in Europe. In 2002, Zimbabwe held elections. Ahead of that election, the EU sent observers. Their chief observer was in breach of his visa condition and was asked to leave the country. In February 2002, as retaliation, the EU placed what they called targeted or restrictive measures on Zimbabwe. What were the measures? 1. At least 20 government officials were banned from Europe. Number 2. No more EU money going to the government. There was 128 million euros that had been budgeted for the Zim government from 2002 to 2007. This was cancelled. Over the past few years, the EU and Zimbabwe relations have improved, and a lot of the EU sanctions are gone. On to the United States. There are two types of US sanctions on Zimbabwe. The first one, ZIDERA, this started in 2001. Then there is also what the US call the Targeted Sanctions Program. This started in 2003. Under the Targeted Sanctions Program, there are companies and people that are on a sanctions list. US companies are not allowed to deal with them. More on this a bit later. Let's start with ZIDERA. That's the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act. This law made several demands. 1. Zimbabwe must respect human rights. 2. Zimbabwe should get out of the DRC. In 1998, together with several other SADC countries, Zimbabwe sent the army into the Congo to fight against rebels there. Number 3. ZIDERA demanded an end to the takeover of white farms. If none of these demands were met, the US would not allow the likes of the IMF or the World Bank to give us any more money or to forgive our debts. Remember, the US controls these institutions. What it says goes. A second version of ZIDERA came into effect in 2018. This was just before the 2018 elections. What did this one say? Restore democracy or we can't be friends. One of the major demands of ZIDERA is this: enforce the ruling of the SADC tribunal. In 2007, a group of white farmers went to a special regional court called the SADC tribunal. Here's what the tribunal said. Number 1. The land reform exercise was racially motivated and it violated the constitution. What it really means is the whole land reform was illegal. It must be reversed. The farmers must get their land back. Number 2. The tribunal said that the farmers must be compensated for the land. Here's the problem. Under the Constitution, under Section 295, Zimbabwe only pays for compensation for improvements on the land, not the land itself. The white farmers want about $9 billion US. In fact, some of the farmers wanted as much as $30 billion US. That's more than the GDP of the entire country. And that's why it's hard to comply with all of the ZIDERA demands. The Zimbabwe government has put up $53 million to pay farmers and will continue to make provisions in its annual budget. To understand why land is central to both the 2001 and 2018 editions of ZIDERA, one has to step back and take a look at the key players involved on both occasions. On the 8th of March 2001, US Senators Bill Frist and Russ Feingold introduced the original ZIDERA bill. Among the bill's sponsors were Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, who were the senators at the time. It was a bipartisan effort, with politicians from across the aisle pushing for the law. But there are two key figures who have been central to ZIDERA, then and now: Senator Jesse Helms in 2001 and Senator Jeff Flake in 2018. Both are conservatives with controversial records on race relations. Helms, one of the longest-serving US senators, was the key proponent of ZIDERA in 2001. Given his decades-long history of opposition to ZANU-PF in particular, and African nationalism in general, his role was hardly surprising. At the center of that original ZIDERA bill, just as in the current version, was the issue of land. Helms had been one of the biggest supporters of Rhodesia and UDI. Ironically, he campaigned for the lifting of sanctions against Ian Smith's administration. Back in America in 1964, Helms had opposed the Civil Rights Act, which removed the discrimination of blacks. He called the law the single most dangerous piece of legislation ever introduced. he described Martin Luther King and his followers as communists and sex perverts. In 1979, Bishop Abel Muzorewa won an election that excluded the majority of blacks. Yet Helms wrote to say, by any objective standard, Rhodesia's elections were free and fair, and sanctions had to go. Muzorewa later visited Washington that year on Helms' invitation, only to lobby for recognition. At the time, despite sanctions on Rhodesia, US corporations like Ford, Standard Oil, and General Motors did good business with Rhodesia via South Africa. Do you see the hypocrisy? Helms died in 2008. One of his protégés in conservative circles, Jeff Flake of Arizona, was there to pick up the mantle. Together with Chris Coons, Flake is one of the key sponsors of the new Zidera Amendment. Just like Helms, he too is a deep conservative. In 1987, Flake testified before the Utah State Senate in support of a resolution in favor of apartheid South Africa. A lobbyist for American mining interests at the time, he said, ironically, given current debates on the impact of sanctions, that he opposed sanctions on South Africa because they hurt ordinary South Africans. So now we know what sanctions we have. Let's look at their impact. The West has always argued that the sanctions are targeted, only affecting individuals and not trade or the entire country. That's simply not true. The illegal sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe by the West have cost the country billions of dollars in lost revenue and lines of credit. US companies can't deal with government companies on the sanctions list. Here's a real example. We have the Industrial Development Corporation, the IDC. It is a state company that had shares in companies like Olivine and the Zimbabwean Fertilizer Company. The IDC used to be on the US sanctions list. In 2016, these companies got money from outside the country to fix their factories. The money was frozen by the US. Another example affecting private businesses. Takunda Chingonzo made an appeal to the then US President Barack Obama. He had nothing to do with the Zimbabwean government, he said, but still, his small business was affected.
So in our working, we came to a point in time where we needed to import a bit of technology from the United States. And so we were engaging in conversation with these US-based businesses. And the response that we got time and time again was that, unfortunately, we cannot do business with you because you're from Zimbabwe. And I was shocked,
Many businesses in Zimbabwe, small and big, can relate. Because of sanctions, it's really hard to move money into Zim. Why? Because banks can be fined for dealing with sanctioned countries. Standard Chartered Bank had to close IDC's bank accounts. The bank was scared of these fines. In April 2019, America fined the bank $18 million for dealing with sanctioned companies. They're not alone. CBZ also got a fine of $385 million. What's the impact? International banks just stopped dealing with Zimbabwe. No one wants the drama. Does this affect Zimbabwe? Yes, it does. Here is how. Banks around the world work together under what's called correspondent banking relationships. For example, when you use your card in one country, the local bank uses its relationship with a bank in another country to clear the transaction. That is how people are able to buy and sell across borders. But because banks are scared of getting caught up in our dispute with the US, they just count us out. So they cut off Zimbabwean banks. According to RBZ, Zimbabwe has lost over 100 such relationships over the past decade. This is why we saw a Chinese bank recently saying, hey, we're not going to deal with Zim. For private companies in Zimbabwe, it's very hard to get loans from outside the country. If they do get money, it's very expensive. They call it a high-risk premium. Even one of the guys behind Zidera says all this. Here is what US Senator Chris Coons said in June last year. It makes it harder for them to access capital. For the government, it gets a lot harder to borrow the money we need for big projects. Debt relief gets harder too. In 2021, the United Nations Special Rapporteur, Elena Dohan, who was in Zimbabwe for 10 days to assess the impact of sanctions on the country, had called for the lifting of sanctions on the Southern African country because they are hurting the poor. I call on all countries which imposed sanctions, as well as banks and companies of third states, as well as countries where these banks are registered, to behave in accordance with the rule of law, due diligence, principle, lift sanctions, make legislation which corresponds with international law and principles of human rights protection. And the last point is that all the discrepancies which exist between all parties, between states, between the government and some sort of opposition leaders, and any other institutions shall be settled on the basis of structural dialogue, Dohan said. What about AGOA? Zimbabwe was banned and excluded from the AGOA. AGOA is America's flagship trade framework with sub-Saharan Africa. It provides preferential duty-free market access to the United States across a range of up to 7,000 products, including textiles. AGOA legislation accords the United States President power to determine by decree which countries are eligible or ineligible on an annual basis, with AGOA coinciding with Zimbabwe's land reform program, which began about the year 2000 and was condemned by the West. Zimbabwe's place in AGOA was a foregone conclusion. Its fate was further cemented by the infamous US sanctions legislation in the form of the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act of 2001. Zimbabwe has not found the necessary repose to prove the kind of stability and progress that would facilitate the removal of ZIDERA to pave the way for AGOA eligibility. Being the only country in SADC outside of AGOA, this is to say an unknown number of investors with potentially billions in investment dollars have avoided coming here in the last 2 decades because of our inability to competitively export to the United States. Outside of AGOA, it is extremely difficult for Zimbabwe's small and medium enterprises to tap into the opportunity-laden US market. This is also at a time when SMEs are emerging to be bulwarks of a floundering economy. SMEs dominated this year's Zimbabwe International Trade Fair in Bulawayo, an event traditionally dominated by well-established big companies. The opposition has a long history of calling for sanctions. In a post-election interview with the Daily Maverick on August 1, 2019, Tendai Biti declared that the international community is not going to be fooled by this madness. We will make sure they don't get a cent. Asked how he would do this, he added, "I can't tell you how, but I can tell you we have done it before." In testimony before the US Foreign Relations Committee in December 2018, Biti said that the debt relief had to be on the condition that there were free elections and a smooth power transfer. However, Regional Observer endorsed Zimbabwe's landmark elections, saying that they were orderly and within the law. The African Union, Southern African Development Community, SADC, Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, COMESA, and the Commonwealth observers said that the voting process was largely free and fair. In January 2002, the late leader of the MDC, Morgan Tsvangirai, called on South Africa to cut off fuel and close the border to Zimbabwe. "I think SA will have to go at it alone and do something effective on the ground," he told the BBC. And South Africa should say, "Okay, under those circumstances, we are going to cut fuel, we are going to cut transport links." Tsvangirai and subsequent leaders of the opposition have also said the following.
They have been talking about sanctions and not imposing any. We have called for EU long time ago to impose tactical sanctions to have an effect on the behavior of this government. It's too late now.
Because the sanctions were put in place to support me. They were put in place to support Mr. Morgan Tsvangirai, our Prime Minister.
Even if you look at ZIDERA is actually supposed to give us an indication. ZIDERA is actually the aspirations of all Zimbabweans.
So now we know what sanctions on Zimbabwe look like. What is Zimbabwe doing about all this? Laws such as AIPA and POSA are being replaced. This has to happen. Not because the US wants that, but because Zimbabweans want that. Government is going ahead with re-engagement. This is why Finance Minister Mthuli Ncube is talking to G7 countries about our debts. That's why the IMF staff monitored program is important. The president set up an interministerial committee to lead political, electoral, and legislative reforms in line with recommendations of the Motlanthe Commission of Inquiry. And we're pushing to make our old friendships work a bit better. We've talked a lot about the Look East policy. It's time to make it work. Outside old friends like China, we are seeing Zimbabwe making more links with the countries in the Gulf and others. Are sanctions the cause of all our problems? No. But are sanctions real? Yes. It is a fact. Do they affect the economy? Yes, they do.